Fans of the Horus Heresy, thank you very much for joining me for a tactics video to talk about the game of Warhammer 40,000. There's a lot of discussion in the community at the moment about the impending release of 8th edition, and in front of us here we have kind of like in two books the start and the current progression of the Warhammer 40,000 rules, going from 1st edition to 7th edition, and if rumours are to be believed, there is a 8th edition on the horizon this year. So back when I did the 500 subscriber giveaway video, a couple of you guys were asking questions. Leakycheese, could you do some videos around tactics of various types? And Clorox Bleach and Philistine AU asked questions around this. I'm going to explore tactics in 40k. But before I get into talking about subjects like gameplay tactics and force structure and how to set up an army, for example, using the Iron Hands as an example, in this video, I'm just going to talk to you about what the game of Warhammer 40,000 is. And one of you guys posed a question, could you talk a bit about 40k for someone who hasn't played it before? So that's what I'm going to do in this video, and I'm going to do it in two main sections. Firstly, I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview about what the overall game is. So in other words, it's a tabletop skirmish war game. Then I'm just going to give my thoughts around what type of tabletop war game it is, in terms of how the mechanics work and the dynamics of the game. And I'm also going to make some comparisons against other games that I've played, because I've played a fair few war games of a variety of types in my time hobbying, and and over time you do get an appreciation for different styles, and 40k has got a very particular style. I'm going to talk to you guys about that. So if you're interested in playing the game and you haven't before, there's some ideas there around what sort of game you're buying into. Also, for everybody else who is experienced to whatever degree of playing it, I hope it's interesting commentary, and I'd also love to hear what your views and opinions are around what sort of game 40k is, and have you got any interesting comparisons against other tabletop war games or other similar types of games. So there you go, that is the premise of this video. So without further ado, let's go in. So what is Warhammer 40,000? Well, Warhammer 40,000 is a skirmish tabletop war game, nominally at the 28mm scale, although that is a heroic 28mm scale. And arguably some people would say it's 30mm or even 32mm. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. The miniatures are the size miniatures are, and it's played on a board, and you use representative 3D models for terrain. And you play between two or more teams, and and the idea is to win in some form or another. So let me take you through what are the key concepts in Warhammer 40,000 as a tabletop war game. So firstly, it uses what is called the I go, you go turn system. So in other words, if I'm playing Joe Bloggs, Leakycheese me will take my turn, I'll do all of my stuff in my turn, and then Joe Bloggs will have his go and do all of his stuff in his go, and then it'll come back to me, and play alternates between the turns like so. So that's the first thing about how it works, and each of those turns are split into distinct phases. So the turn has got structure, so you'll go movement, you'll go shooting, you'll go melee, so on and so forth, and then morale, and you'll work your way through. So the size of the game, 40k uses a point system to balance forces. So there's loads of army lists, and you'll have seen from my other videos all the different reviews that I've done. And the same is true of 40k as well. In the Horus Heresy, the size of battle is supposed to be from around 1750 to 2000 points upwards, which is a decent sized game, and it's designed for bigger games than normal 40ks, which plays equally well at smaller points, so maybe 1000 to 1250. What does that translate to in terms of your force size as well? In Heresy, depending on the type of force you play, you're playing with forces between 20 models to several hundred models. So if you're playing a force with a high points density per unit, so for example the Mechanicum in certain iterations, and certainly the recently released Talons of the Emperor, which has a very high points density if you play Legio Custodes, you might only have 20 units in 2000 points. If you go to the other end and you play the Militia list, which has got a very low points density per unit, you could easily get several hundred models into 2,000 points. And if you ramp the points up further, then you can get some enormous armies. So that's the sort of size of the game. It uses a real line of sight system. So in other words, when you're determining if you can attack units or any line of sight effect, you are trying to draw a line of sight from one miniature to another miniature, be it your friendly ones if that's the effect, or yours to the enemies. So you may need some form of a line of sight determining device. So it could be a ruler, tape measure, or even a laser pointer. When I talked about 40k having an I go, you go system, that means that in general, you only do actions with troops in your own turn. There are a handful of exceptions to that, but the general rule is you only do your own actions in your own phase. So in other words, you only shoot it normally in your phase with your troops, and conversely, your opponent does the same. And there are a few exceptions to the shooting bit. So for example, units with what's called the interceptor rule can interrupt your opponent's phase in certain circumstances to fire on certain units. There is a notable exception to this rule, the I go, you go, which generally applies to movement, shooting and psionics. And the exception is assault and melee. And melee, any units that are involved in melee get to fight every turn. The pace of combat in melee is double that of shooting in terms of the attack rates as described in the rules. That's a very important mechanic, and it means that if you do get into combat, then the pace of combat is quicker. It doesn't necessarily always mean it's deadlier, it's just quicker. A very important concept to understand in 40k is not all units are able to damage other units. If you've played any sort of historical war game, essentially no soldiers are going to be immune to the effects of attacks. They're just not heavy, you just can't armour them enough. You know, in general, most units are vulnerable to other units, and a game that I've got a lot of experience of playing, which is Battletech, every unit is vulnerable to every other unit in the game. So the weakest infantry unit can, in theory, destroy the most powerful battle mech with a single hit if they're lucky. 40k doesn't have that. There are a whole host of units that cannot be damaged by other units because their stats, if it be an armour value or a toughness value, is too high to be damaged. So that's a very important mechanic, and I'll come back to that, the consequences of that later. There's a lot of dice rolling in 40k. Every warrior normally has one dice to throw for a particular ability. So for a shooting attack, let's say a space marine armed with a bolt pistol will throw one dice for attack. If you've got a unit of 20 marines armed that way, you have to throw 20 dice to make that attack. So it doesn't use a scaling system. So the more people who shoot, the more potent an attack becomes on a single dice. No, you just throw more and more dice. So yeah, there's lots of dice to throw, particularly in the heresy. And then you have to throw those dice a lot of time. So if we take the example of combat attacks, and this applies equal to melee and shooting, you have to roll to hit, you then have to roll to wound. The target, if it's entitled to, then gets a saving throw. If the target then has a special ability, such as Feel No Pain, it gets in effect another saving throw. So it's not uncommon for a set of attacks, you might have to make a sequence of 4 consecutive rolls to determine the outcome. So yeah, there can be a lot of dice to throw. Now I talked about how certain units can't be damaged by other units. And likewise, there are lots of units that are very resistant to attacks from other units. So let's think of a good example. So a good example might be a monstrous creature. So it typically might have a very high toughness stat, and toughness is your resistance to damage. And then on top of that, you might have a saving throw or 2 saving throws. So that means for like a human infantryman armed with an average weapon, it's very hard to damage it. However, there are lots of specialised weapons in the game that are capable of inflicting damage on those tougher units actually quite easily. The enormous array of units and the very wide range of combat capabilities going from an average human soldier all the way up to a super heavy tank or an enormous monstrous creature means that, and the specific counters you might need against each unit, there is a certain rock, paper, scissors mechanic to the game, whereby if you are up against a certain sort of opponent and you don't have the right type of weapon to fight them, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And that means that when you build armies, you always need to ensure you cover all your capabilities in terms of your offensive punch, shall we say. 40k plays on a turn basis, and if you play scenarios from the books, These are actually quite short games in terms of the number of turns, and typically they are going to run between 5 and 7 turns. Now, so that is actually not that long, really. And for another important thing to understand about 40k is it's actually been changed over the years, and going from this book here to this book here, it's gradually evolved into a game that's actually quite geared and orientated towards competitive and tournament play. In this book, it was very open-ended, and some of the earlier books, it's very open-ended as to how long a game was. This book, it's much more narrowly defined. Now, of course, there's nothing to stop you ignoring the rules about game length, and you can play longer games as you want. But that's another feature of 40k, the way scenarios control the turn length. The final high-level concept to consider with Warhammer 40,000 is the futuristic setting. And what this means is you have an enormous variety of different armies to take, and each army has got very specific characteristics. So while I said that you've got a wide variety of units, well, you've then also got a wide variety of armies, each with their own particular flavour of play. And some armies are very balanced across the board, others are very specialised at, say, melee, and others may be very specialised at shooting, and all sorts of other specialisations as well. That means that there's this huge variety of options available, and that's one of the big attractions of the game, because in the main all those options are backed up by ranges of miniatures. So if you like the look and the idea of a rule set, you buy the miniatures to play it. Enormous variety of army lists and capabilities, and the differences in 40k are quite extreme compared to some of the games. I think the quality gradient can be absolutely enormous in 40k. That's kind of like a brief overview, some key mechanics and how the game plays. Now, what you might call the philosophical musings part of the video on 40k. So in this part of the video, I'm going to talk more about the style of gameplay in 40k, and also give comparisons against other war games and how they operate, to kind of give you a feel for what type of game Warhammer 40,000 is. So firstly, what is my perspective? Well, I've been wargaming for nearly 30 years on and off, and so I've played a lot of games just in terms of sheer number, and I've played science fiction games. I've played, such as 40k, Cryomech, and that sort of genre of science fiction skirmish games. I've played fantasy games, like Warhammer Fantasy Battle, a game called Flintlock, if anyone remembers that. I suppose I'd include War Machine there. I was quite into War Machine when that first came out. And I've played a bit of Lord of the Rings as well, which is another good game, which is another very good gaming system. And I've also played historical games. So, and when I say historical, I mean ancient games. So things like Warhammer Ancients Battle, which is a very good application of a Warhammer rule system. Napoleonic war games. And then also modern and ultra-modern war games as well. So everything from that you might consider sort of like Second World War-ish through to operations in, say, Iraq and Afghanistan. So yeah, played quite a lot of those sorts of games. Played games that are tabletop based, which is probably the majority, but also map-based games. And when I think of map-based games, I think in particular of Battletech, the sci-fi armor game. Also played quite a lot of scales. So I played 1 to 300th scale games, so Battletech's 1 to 285, but that sort of thing. Star Grunt, although that's skirmish again, it's bigger scale. 28mm, which is all the 40k scale stuff. 54mm, so people may remember the Inquisitor game that Games Workshop did a number of years back with the large models. And also micro naval as well, so that might be First World War naval. Things such as Full Thrust, which is science fiction micro naval scale as well. Yeah, so that's kind of like my perspective and how the experience base, our basis judgments on. So, 40k, so it's a skirmish game, and it takes the design concept of one model equals one warrior. Some games treat a unit, so I don't know, let's say you have a unit that is 10 people, and that is then a unit, and it kind of like is a bit it's sort of like indistinguishable. In 40k, although you have the concept of unit, everything is also very individually statted as well. That's one important concept in 40k. It uses a 1-to-1 scale, so whatever miniatures you're using, they are that big. Vehicles are that big. infantry of that size, and you use those models for determining LOS and movement. So if you can't fit a vehicle down an alleyway, well, it can't fit. It uses a very representative terrain system where what you have is what is there. A really important part of 40k is to understand the ground scale. Now, I don't know if they talk about this in the current rules, but originally the ground scale was that 1 inch is equal to 2 meters. And I think basically that principle still applies. What this means is that weapon ranges are extremely short in Warhammer 40,000 if you compare them to, let's say, anything remotely recognisable as modern warfare with, you know, high-tech engineered firearms. The current thinking is that most infantry combat is conducted at ranges of up to, say, 400 metres, and the weapons that infantry carry are effective more or less at those sorts of ranges. In 40k, that's not the case. You know, your typical small arm, so let's go heresy and talk about a bolt gun. It's got a range of 24 inches, so it's only got an effective in-game range of about 50 meters. So the range combat is very short ranged, without a shadow of a doubt, and that has a big effect on melee, and we'll come to that in a moment. However, although the weapon ranges are very short, the weapon accuracy is actually high. And if you make an attack, even an average human has got a 50-50 chance of scoring a hit. So that's like saying, under the stress of combat, a basic human soldier has got a 50-50 chance of scoring a hit in any shot. That's actually pretty accurate. And then, you know, elite units can get much, much more accurate. So short ranges, yes. High accuracy also. So weapons are pretty accurate at the ranges you can fight at. However, the hitting power isn't always that high. So I was using my example about a human warrior having a 50-50 chance of hitting. Well, against a like target with an average basic human weapon, you've only got a 50-50 chance of inflicting an injury. That's not very high, really. And, you know, if you look at the effectiveness of modern weapons, arguably the lethality is reduced a bit on the wound roll. Although saying that, because of the enormous quality range, there are plenty of weapons that are very deadly. However, the lethality of those weapons is always tempered by the fact that 40k rarely allows you to have an automatic wound, or automatically cause damage, or automatically cause a hit. Across the board of a game, most of the time you've got a random element to determine if a particular action happens or not, even when it's really extreme. So if you imagine, let's take the most powerful weapon system in the game, so I don't know, the Bellicosa volcano cannon on a Warlord Titan. If you shoot that at an infantryman in the open, there is still a 1 in 6 chance that he won't take an injury off that enormous weapon hit. When you think about the power of a gun involved and make a comparison to an equivalent modern day weapon, wouldn't imagine them surviving being in the blast radius, but 40k does keep that random element in there. That feeds into that theme of competitive play. There's always a chance that things may go your way when it's going badly, and there's always a chance that things might go badly when you've got a really good, what looks like a really good attack. So it has that random element around that. Morale is interesting in 40k. In the main, morale actually doesn't have that much effect. And particularly for a game involving enormous number of terrifying and very powerful ranged weapons, morale doesn't have a big influence. Most of the time, if you want your troops to do something, they will do it. So if you want your troops to charge across open ground, you can move them. There's no test to say, I'm going to motivate my squad to charge across the open knowing that there's some enemy dug in across the field. You don't get that in 40k. You only have to check for morale once you've taken the casualties. And also, when you're being shot at, most of the time, you don't have any pinning effects. And that's unusual, particularly given the short range. It's very easy from a point of view of command decisions to get your troops to do what you want them to. Whether or not they're successful, that's another question. But in terms of the intention to perform an action, it's very easy to get them to do it. Armour. Now, this is where the sci-fi bit really comes in. So there's lots of extremely effective personal armour available to troops in Warhammer 40,000. The obvious example is your classic Space Marine in his suit of powered armour. And This means that certain troops are very resilient to taking casualties. However, there are also conversely equally effective counter weapons, but they tend to be in much shorter supply. So in the same way that it's very easy to get your troops to do what you want them to do, the very tough personal armour means that you can sometimes charge your infantry across that field if they're well enough armoured and succeed, which is quite unlike what you might, it's quite unlike what you would get in a modern war game, where even troops that are wearing body armour are not that well protected against high-powered infantry rifles. And if you try a charge like that, well, you just get gunned down. Not so in 40k. If your Space Marines charge across a field at guardsmen, they will probably make it and win on the other side. On top of that, then you've also got all the weird and wonderful stuff like the dreadnoughts and the robots. With dreadnoughts and robots, you've got units that combine the resilience of tanks with the size and mode of movement of infantry. So, okay, dreadnoughts are bigger than infantry, but they're a lot smaller than tanks. So you have these like little pocket-sized tanks that you can use to project your power as well. So there's kind of like a whole tier of units, special units like that, that bridge the gap between full-size armoured units and your infantry. You've got your kind of dreadnoughts, and of course your dreadnoughts are always very combat-focused, so they never transport or anything. They're always assault and anti-tank units. Are very powerful combat pieces. So I've been talking about my thoughts on 40k and the mechanics of it, and I've not mentioned melee much. Melee in Warhammer 40,000 can be very significant, and this is one of the kind of like oddities, shall I say, of the style of combat in Warhammer 40,000. So for a game which has your warriors equipped with very powerful futuristic guns, and you have very highly trained warriors as well, there is also a very high chance of being able to engage in melee or hand-to-hand combat. And this is kind of like part of the dynamic this is a fundamental dynamic about how the game works. And it's been set up this way, I think, I suppose from a point of view of balancing the game. And there are certain armies that are very, well, hand-to-hand style combat focused and built, and I don't know, if you look at the 40k world, you've got the Tyranids, which have got a lot of focus on short range and hand-to-hand combat. And there are units in the Marine Legions as well that are focused on hand-to-hand combat, like the World Eater Legion, for example. And this, for a futuristic sci-fi ranged combat game, this is unusual. And it's kind of like, it's one of the unique characters, and this is a particular flavour of how warfare in the 41st and 31st millennium works. You still get a lot of close combat, and there's a whole variety of very specialised and sophisticated close combat weapons. And if you remember earlier when I talked about the game mechanics, if you're a player who can successfully manoeuvre your units into melee, and you've got the right weapon, then you can do a lot of damage very quickly in that close combat. Melee is probably the area where morale is particularly significant. And unlike at range combat, where you don't really have, apart from the odd specialised weapon, you don't have pinning effects, and your troops are actually quite resistant to casualties from range combat. In melee, even a handful of casualties in a really big unit can lead to that unit being wiped out because of the way the overrun rule works. 40k is a range combat game, and there's a lot of powerful guns. However, if you got the right units and you skillfully manoeuvre them into close combat against a weaker opponent, then the odds really stack up in your favour of getting a devastating blow very quickly in close combat. And I suppose that's realistic, isn't it? And also the game deliberately waters down the effect of troops being able to react to people assaulting them, i.e. charging into close combat, because Overwatch fire is not very accurate. That also favours a bold attacker as well. And then finally, just to come back to what I said earlier about game length, most of the scenarios in 40k are structured to be short. And what this means is it pushes players to take bold moves to complete their objectives, because you can't carefully and methodically and slowly work your way tactically up, because you've got a very finite time. The clock is ticking against you, and you can very easily run out of time. So the short length of the game pushes players to be bold, certainly if you want to win. So short game length, objective based, means you've got to move quickly to try and win. So what do I think about all these thoughts about what the game of 40k actually is then like? Well, when you take all these things into consideration, what 40k is, it is a skirmish war game that represents extremely close range fights that are fought very, very intensely and at a very fast pace. And you might say that that's not unlike real warfare, fought at point blank range either. But it is very intense. The battles are very short, and also your troops are extremely highly motivated, and their morale is actually really, really good, even for quite poor quality troops. When you compare it to games that try to represent the way that humans react when they're being shot at, 40k troops are almost reckless with abandon in terms of their personal safety. And Space Marines, with their very high motivation, their psychological conditioning, well, yeah, you can imagine that. But even normal human troops, very highly motivated. 40k, where you've got, let's say, imagine you've got 2 squads of Marines. You've got a heavy weapon squad armed with heavy bolters, and then a group of tactical Marines, and then you're attacking, I don't know, a big unit of militia. What you might imagine happening if this is a real world scenario is heavy bolters will be firing on the militia to pin them, while your Marines, your tactical Marines, move up into closer range to force them out of position or rout them with some close range fire. However, in 40k it doesn't work like that. The heavy bolters, when you fire on the enemy troops, you're trying to destroy them, you're trying to kill them. You're not going to pin them, so you're trying to reduce their numbers down to give your Space Marines make their job easier when they close as well. Yeah, and likewise, you wouldn't so it's all about just destroying your opponents, and you wouldn't get the situation where your tactical Marines in your kind of real world scenario close to the range where they then get in. They then can start firing on the guard or the militia, allowing the heavy weapon team to maneuver to a better position, and kind of like leapfrogging, and one unit always firing to cover the other one's movement. It doesn't work like that. It's all about destroying your opponents, which is, I suppose, quite an unusual concept, really, because there's a famous quote of military philosophy that it's easier to break the minds of men than to destroy their bodies. There you have it. A bit random and rambling, perhaps, like videos, but yeah, those are my thoughts on 40k and what it is and what it's like as a game. Closing thoughts. Well, what does it compare to? I mean, what does it compare to games-wise? I mean, I guess it's a bit like War Machine in terms of the lethality. It always puts me in mind of that. If you've played Warlord games Beyond the Gates of Antares, which is also interestingly written by Rick Priestley, it's very different to that game, because that game's got a very real world style morale system. A really important part of Antares is the use of pinning to force your opponents into not being able to operate effectively. So it doesn't compare anything like that. It doesn't compare to the old Crimec game, because in Crimec you had to motivate your troops. So the command control element was very important in Crimec, and also the amount of dice rolling was very, very much lower than in 40k. It doesn't compare to Tomorrow's War, because Tomorrow's War again has got a realistic morale system to reflect the effects of pinning and shooting, and it's often easier to break your opponent's minds as opposed to their bodies. So it doesn't really compare to that. It does put me in mind of it kind of puts me in mind of the old Mutant Chronicles Warzone game. Well, it's not that old, it's still in production, still available. That's a similar sort of fast-paced sci-fi game, and it has a strong melee element as well as the shooting element. So that's probably a better comparison. All in all, I think 40k, it does have a really unique flavour to it. It's a funny mix of super high-tech ranged weapons, massive powerful tanks, dreadnoughts, robots, titans, but at the same time where you can still win a battle by fighting. You can still win a battle in close combat. Yeah. It's very, has a very unique flavour. One final thought is the fact that what game has got such an enormous range of miniatures backing it up, allowing you to have all this variety of units. I guess that's another key thing. It's not just a game, it's also the product that supports it as well. That's very significant with 40k. So that's the end of this little musing video about the nature of Warhammer 40,000, what it is and what it compares a bit, and a few of my own personal opinions on it. I hope you found that interesting. If you've got some of your own thoughts and opinions about 40k, something that I missed. I'm sure I've missed absolutely loads with this. I wrote a big pile of notes, but sure I've missed loads. Or stuff that you've done that I've not done, please share it in the comments. I'll be fascinated to hear. Thank you very much for watching. I'll speak to you next time, and goodbye.